Okay, let's break down the joint structure classification schemes. And as we discussed previously, there's going to be two basic types. The first is the solid mass of connective tissue. So the solid masses of connective tissue are actually connecting the bone or binding the bone. And these have specific names sometimes. They'll have specific sutural names in terms of ligaments. So the sutural ligament's a big one. We'll talk a little bit more about the ones of the distal ends of limb bones as well. Okay, as discussed in a previous module, there are going to be two basic types of joint structure classification schemes. The first is going to be where the connective tissue is actually binding the bone. The second, you're going to have that connective tissue capsule that's going to connect the bone, but there'll be space within the capsule region. Now let's turn our attentions back to the solid mass of connective tissue. There are two examples of those, or two types of those. The first is fibrous. These are going to connect bone by dense, regular, or irregular connective tissue. The second is going to be cartilaginous, and just as the name would suggest, it's going to be composed of cartilage. Generally, it's going to be hyaline cartilage. And then the second type is going to be that connective tissue capsule, and we associate those with synovial joints. So let's talk about those fibrous joints in a bit more detail. There are going to be three types of fibrous joints. The first is sutures, and we talked a lot about that when we were talking about the skull. There'll be Gomphosis and Syndesmosis. So sutures are only found in the skull, so only between bones of the skull. We think of your frontal, your sagittal, your lambdoidal, but there will be sutures anywhere that you have two bones connecting in the skull. These are going to be, this really should read immovable. Sorry for the typo there. So that should read immovable in adults. In juveniles, it's slightly movable. So if you think about that soft spot or the fontanelle, that's an example of where a suture will be in adults. So slightly movable, obviously, in juveniles, but once you reach adulthood, that movement should stop. Now eventually, particularly with a really advanced age, you'll have the actual replacement of the ligament with bone, and that's referred to as a synostosis. So this is a bony joint where you don't have any connective tissue anymore, all you have left is bone. So sutures specific to the skull. Gomphoses are going to be specific to your alveolar region or your teeth. So this is one of those examples where you don't have a bone-to-bone connection, you have a tooth and bone connection. And it's the perfect example of a peg and socket joint. So you have that peg, which is the tooth, fitting into the alveolar region of either the maxilla, which is going to be your upper jaw, or your mandible, which is your lower jaw. So your periodontal ligaments, which really keeping that tooth within the bone. And the last type of fibrous joint is a syndesmosis, very similar to some of the other terms that we're going to discuss a little bit later. So really pay attention to the terminology here. Now this is a type of fibrous joint, so this is going to be that dense irregular or dense irregular connective tissue. What's different is that it's just going to be more substantial. Generally, it's going to be a little bit wider. The best example of syndesmoses are interosseous membrane. So recall your radius and your ulna of the forearm. You're going to have this very distinct connective tissue that's going to connect the shafts of the two bones. You have the same thing in terms of your lower limb. So between the tibia and the fibula, you'll have a syndesmosis joint there as well. So those are the three examples of fibrous joints. In terms of cartilaginous joints, there are two types. There are your primary cartilaginous joints and your secondary cartilaginous joints. And these are actually quite different. Synchondroses are almost always temporary joints, meaning that they're important in terms of bone growth. So once that bone completely replaces the cartilage, then it's a synostosis, it's a bony joint. Whereas symphyses are secondary, they're there for life. And they're going to be composed of slightly different cartilages as well. So as we discussed, those synchondroses are those epiphyseal plates. You'll have the replacement of bone on the diaphyseal side, and eventually you'll have the complete replacement with bone to become a synostosis. So no movement is allowed at these joints. The second type of cartilaginous joints are symphyses or symphysis. And these are really cool. These are some of my favorite joints. They're only going to be located in the midline, okay? So think of the midline of your body. This is the only place where you'll have symphyses. These are composed of not only hyaline cartilage, but also you'll have a fibrocartilaginous disc, typically right in the middle of the joint, for additional strength of that joint. So the two main examples of a symphysis, you have your pubic symphysis, which is going to be the anterior portion of your pelvic girdle. This can have a slight bit of movement, particularly in individuals that are pregnant, especially as they get closer to delivering the baby. You'll have a bit more movement in these joints. The other main type of symphysis are actually in these intervertebral discs, or those cartilaginous portions between the bodies of your vertebrae. Okay? And if you think about it, you can move your vertebral column. It's because of these joints right here in the midline. All right, so those are the fibrous and cartilaginous joints. Let's talk a little bit about, we'll introduce synovial joints and we'll get into a bit more detail later on, but there's going to be three common structures in all synovial joints. The first is the actual capsule, and this is the connective tissue portion of the synovial joint. So this is what's actually binding the bones to one another. Now note, what's different about the synovial joints from the other two types of joints we were just discussing is these are going to be on the side of the joints. They're not binding right in the middle, okay? So the binding is going to be on the edges, allowing for the synovial cavity, which is the space that's left because of the not direct articulation between the connective tissue between the bones. So this plays a huge role in terms of why synovial joints are movable. If there wasn't that space there, you wouldn't have as much movement capable there. The third thing that you're going to find in all synovial joints is that hyaline cartilage remnant, which we refer to as articular cartilage. Now this is a unique area. It's very important in terms of shock absorption, in terms of allowing for movement to occur smoothly. It is avascular, so if there's any damage to the articular cartilage, then you can actually get that bone-on-bone contact that you do not want, which can be extremely painful.